The criminal is the creative artist, the detective, only the critic. G.K. Chesterton, The Blue Cross. This is AMI Audiobook Review. I'm your host, Jacob Szymanski. That quote, that type of tone that seems to glorify crime and violence is exactly what's bringing host of My Life in Books, Red Széll, back to the table today. The criminal is the creative artist, the detective, only the critic. Crime is not an art. Does this bother you as much as it does me, Red?
I know, it's a brilliant quote from way over 100 years ago, I'd guess. And there does seem to be a glorification of the stories of the crimes that are meant to shock and upset us. And yes, it's quite difficult to go onto any podcast site and not be bombarded with true crime stories and
Constantly.
yeah, we are gonna tell you a little factoid that you didn't know about one of the most notorious cases of all time. It has to be said, that's why I prefer novels. But as you say, even novelists are guilty of glamorizing and dramatizing um, true crime. And I mean, right from the very beginning, the first great crime novel, The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins, was inspired by the Road Hill house murder of 1860 in Wiltshire, in England.
Now, when people think of true crime, we think of podcasts and documentaries. So, how does true crime cross over into like novels and literature? Because we have seen that in the past couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I say, 'twas ever thus, but I think the person who really managed to create the genre was probably Truman Capote with his 1966 book In Cold Blood, which took a notorious murder in Kansas of the Clutter family by a pair of convicts who believed that this small town family in Kansas had a safe full of money. It was a mistaken belief, but they went in and they murdered these parents and their two kids and then did a runner. And Truman Capote was fascinated by the crime and wrote In Cold Blood, which blended for the first time really journalism and documentary and crime and dramatized the characters, especially of the two convicts who, spoiler here, were eventually executed, come through as really 3D psychological characters. We get really into their minds and their motivations, and uh, arguably Truman Capote lost his ability to be non-judgmental. He became very, very involved with one of the two convicts,
Hmm.
and I would say actually is becomes a bit of an unreliable narrator himself by dint of doing so. But that is the book that I think really set the genre.
And what you just described there, the author, the creator of a true crime or a
Mm,
novel getting directly involved in a
yeah,
case is one of the big concerns that people have with true crime
yeah.
nowadays. What are the ethical problems that people have with it? And I do want to get into the ethics of it eventually in this conversation.
Mm.
Um, but I want to talk about something that you're having on your show, My Life in Books, uh, coming out just this week. And it has to do with an author that you interviewed who was obsessed with the Jack the Ripper case.
Yeah, and this is
What is that story?
right. This is an author who actually got in touch with the show direct. She's
Cool.
British. But she's got Canadian relatives. As she found out when she started a genealogy project, looking into her family, and her name's Sarah Bax Horton, and she discovered that her great 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 grandfather was one of the detectives working on the Jack the Ripper case, the Whitechapel murders that are, well,
Whoa.
it's the most famous unsolved case in police history around the world, I'd say. And she disappeared down the rabbit hole. And in the interview, I discovered that she had been working as a volunteer for the City of London Police, just going through their archives. So she knows her way around an archive. And the deeper she went into this rabbit hole, the more fascinated she became with the identity of Jack the Ripper and why the murders stopped as suddenly as they started. And then she turned up some documentation from various, well, as they were called then, lunatic asylums that she thinks identifies the perpetrator, the real Jack the Ripper, and explains why the murders stopped. And she comes out with a name and a profile and adds that information into the whole Jack the Ripper genre and recreates the crimes as if this man, whose name I will not give away, because she does that in her book, as if this man was on the spot, and she identifies, that actually he could have been on the spot and why he might have been operating to this kind of murder calendar that he was operating to. And
Wow.
it is, I mean, it's massively compelling. I don't often stay up reading chapter after chapter after chapter at night because doing the job that I do, that could really easily become a habit. But I started this and I just carried on listening because I had to find out. And as I say, as far as real life crime reconstruction is concerned, it's spot on. And interestingly, without all the bells and whistles that we tend to associate with the podcasts of true crime that we listen to.
So this author, says that she's discovered essentially an alternative solution to the mystery of the identity of Jack the Ripper almost more than 100 years after the fact.
Yeah, it's slightly more nuanced than that, only because actually a couple of senior policemen who worked on the case wrote memoirs after the event and said they knew who the perpetrator was, but for reasons that they didn't necessarily disclose, they were not going to talk about it. And again,
Wow.
she identifies why they said that and why actually it might not be the most famous unsolved case of all time. It might just be the most grisly, rumored to be unsolved case of all time. And I'm sorry to be a bit coy, but I don't want to give away all the secrets of the show ahead of it. But she, as I say, makes a very compelling
Wow.
case.
Before we move on, what's the name of the book and the author?
The name of the book is One Armed Jack, Uncovering the Real Jack the Ripper, and the name of the author is Sarah Bax, B-A-X, Horton. And as I say, it's available as an audiobook around the world. And she got in touch with me because of her Canadian connections, of which she is very proud and of which I am very glad, because otherwise I would not know about this great book.
So, wait, so Red, when you got that call from her, did she say, "Hey, Mr. Sale, I've been investigating the Jack the Ripper case, and can we ask you a few questions?" Did that make you nervous at all?
Exactly. Yes. Anything I say may be taken down in evidence. Yeah. No. At first, it has to be said, I opened the email going, "What? Somebody reckons they've identified Jack the Ripper? What? Not another one?" And then, no. This is proper historical research. She knows her onions.
Isn't it weird that you stayed up all night listening to this book
Mm.
about grisly crimes, about brutal murders that had huge effects on the lives of obviously the victims, but also the friends and family of the victims.
Yeah.
Like, this is a cause of huge pain and suffering, and you're finding entertainment out of it. I'm not shouting
Yeah.
you out. I'm not
No, no, no,
criticizing
no, no.
you. This is the nature of true crime. It's like, isn't that weird?
Oh, human beings are very weird. But I mean, I was talking to my daughter about this. She's a psychology student, and I was just going, what is it? Why are we so fascinated by the worst in humanity? And and she just said it's because we want to set the world back on its axis. We want closure. So something awful happens, and that we want to know why the perpetrator did it. We want them to be brought to justice, and we want to try and understand how some people can break through that barrier of control that most of us have. We all feel rage at some point because somebody does or says something to us that we just think is unforgivable. But most of us are able to sort of bottle that up, turn away, swear, kick an inanimate object, and just go, fine, okay, I'll get on with my life. But some people just snap and they do something terrible and unforgivable. And I think we need to understand that. And then we also need to know that somebody is going to set the world back on its feet. I think it's fascinating that the golden age of crime that they talk about with, G.K. Chesterton, Dorothy L. Sayers, Agatha Christie, Marjorie Allingham, Nio Marsh, all these amazing crime writers who are still published and read today, they were all writing in the wake of the First World War, the most horrific, murderous thing that had ever happened
In human history.
in human history. Every family was affected in some way, shape, or form. And somebody like Miss Marple or Hercule Poirot or, Lord Peter Wimsey, some member of the establishment, comes along and says, okay, something terrible has happened, but I can explain it and we can put it all behind us and the world will carry on. And, G.K. Chesterton was brilliant with this, with his Father Brown stories. In fact, it's understandable that he used a priest to do that, because for many people, that's where they found, solace and comfort, knowing that they
Mm.
might see their loved ones in heaven again. There was a huge explosion of spiritualism after the First World War as well. But murder stories, crime stories, country house murder stories, where the very fabric of what it meant to be British, the country house, the family, of standing who look after the peasantry and the local, the local magistrate and the local women's institute, and a murder happens in their house, and then somebody comes along and solves it and makes everything better again.
There's something kind of symbolic about that,
Yeah,
especially happening after the First World War, something that would have desensitized people to um, the nature of humanity, that we can do horrible things
yeah,
just as much as we can do beautiful things. It's that contrast of a pre-war and then a post-war world where you kind of have to confront the realities of humanity, right? And I do want to push back a little bit on this idea that like true crime really blew up uh, after the First World War,
mm,
because I think there's absolutely like a peak in its interest during that time, but humans have always had a fascination with I don't want to say true crime, but I will say just the macabre.
yeah.
Um, you mentioned closure earlier and how we just seek it. There's no better sense of closure than a good old fashioned medieval public execution. which which those things attracted thousands of people and had carnival
Yeah.
like atmospheres with vendors and performers and lots of different merchants that were there to sell their wares. And the more ghastly the crime, the more infamous the criminal, the bigger the crowds would be. And the stories of these condemned people would need to be out there to the public to, advertise these huge events, so people needed a way to learn about the criminals. And that's where crime pamphlets came in. I
Yeah.
thought this was really interesting, and I found out there were these small, maybe 25, 30-page little unbound pamphlets you can buy for cheap at coffee shops and public places. And there was a huge range of angles in the ways that these things took on crime, but it was always detailing acts of crime for the public to consume as entertainment. Sound familiar?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right. And sometimes it would be very matter of fact or just plain unaltered transcripts of court proceedings.
Hmm.
Other times it was state propaganda, but more often than not, it was sensational retellings of real cases that were only produced to get a buck.
Yeah.
And then in right before the Second World War, there was a magazine called True Detective that had stories with the details of real crimes along with the investigation
Mhm.
proceedings, and it was a cultural phenomenon. It a massive phenomenon. It was a massive phenomenon. It had thousands in its readership. But my point is, stories of real crime, not just made up murder mystery, fictional crimes, has always been deniable in getting our attention. Um, and it continues to this day. And true crime is just the continuation of that.
Absolutely. We're just seeing the latest iteration of it
Exactly.
in,
It's
yeah,
always been there.
with the latest technology. And yeah, of course, the advent of the printing press meant that you could produce more and more and more of these little pamphlets and sell them for a groat apiece. And yes, so I think podcasters across the world are finding that this is the latest. Well, it's the latest iteration of a story that's as old as writing and storytelling, isn't it?
And I don't want to make this like a pearl clutching conversation,
Mm.
because I can't deny the storytelling narrative power of true crime. You think of the psychology behind what makes people commit crimes, it's fascinating, right? Think of the pressures, the uh, the social factors that lead someone to do something
Mhm.
horrible. Uh, if you take those stories and use them to inspire yourself to write a novel about it, I can almost guarantee you're going to have very interesting characters and very interesting plot points and events. Right? There's a lot of reasons why authors specifically gravitate towards stories of crimes.
Oh, I think you raise a really interesting point there. Authors of fiction, particularly, but I think, journalistic authors as well, they love to put their characters under pressure and see how they react to questioning and suspicion
Mm.
and gaps in their own knowledge. And I think that's meat and drink to most writers. Look at the police procedural. I mean, I personally have read so many police procedurals over the years that I find it quite difficult to read anymore nowadays, and certainly do not particularly enjoy podcasts that follow the police procedure. But they are classic examples of, you know, the hanging question or the really hard interview, accusational interview, the good cop, bad cop type of dynamic. And I mean, that is the core of drama in many ways. Just to, and so yes, I think there is no coincidence that crime and drama are so closely linked, and that true crime becomes dramatized, because I think we've all asked ourselves the question, you know, what would I do if I was wrongly um, accused of murder. Would I? How could I get myself off the hook? You would only be able to tell the truth. But if somebody doesn't believe your truth, then they're just going to hammer at you. And we know that everybody has their breaking point, and that's what we as human beings are fascinated by.
It's fascinating because when you think about it this way, every crime has a start, middle, and end,
Mm.
and fascinating characters and conflict and twists. And because it's a crime, deception. Though those are a lot of ingredients to make a very compelling fictional story, just happens to be real. And
Yeah.
and we document crime very much so. And so it's easy for authors to go and dive and get inspired by these things.
And the thing about crime is that every crime that is committed gets a second and often third and sometimes fourth life because the crime gets committed. It gets reconstructed in reports.
Right. There's like the first like hypothesis of what happened, and then you have to reevaluate, and then you have different ideas of what might have happened. It's like multiple stories are being told at the same time. You're trying to piece together
Yeah.
the real story.
And then it goes to trial. And
Yes. Oh my God. Don't even get me started with trial. There's
oh,
court TV in the United States. Like, if you couldn't ask for a better story.
I know, absolutely. Well, yeah, just it's real life drama, and they don't have to pay the participants, which is why the TV companies love it. But it's yeah, and then maybe you get a retrial, and if in some cases you get many retrials. It's the gift that continues giving, and journalists. I was one. We get paid by the inch of newsprint. A crime story will always provide you with a meal on the table at the end of the week. And if you look at the percentages of books published each year, an enormous percentage is crime, whether that's cozy or true crime or you get science fiction crime. You get every genre has a crime element. I think I even read a rom-com a few years ago that had a crime element, a kind of crime caper to it, which I did think broke new grounds. But
Well, of course, there's a crime element. It's because the main love interest stole the other's heart.
oh right.
Now, like, the criticisms of the true crime genre are obvious, and we're not
Mm.
going to be the first ones to make these points. But a lot of critics argue that the true crime genre commodifies real tragedies, and that it it turns the suffering of victims into entertainment. Do you push back on that at all?
There's part of me that would just say, "Yeah, 'twas ever thus." I
It was
so
ever thus.
it
You're
is,
still British, my guy.
I yeah. Look, I have heard some. I've heard some podcasts, some true crime podcasts over the last 5 years where I've just gone, I am so glad I am not related to the victims here. And I'm so glad I'm not living in the village or the part of London where that happened,
Mhm.
because I feel that you've got a hungry journalist coming in, so-called journalist, coming in and trampling all over people's feelings and ripping the scabs off barely healed wounds. Yes, I do think there are bad operators out there. As far as the novelization of crimes is concerned, Agatha Christie always said that she wrote a lot of her books because she was fascinated by the Buck Ruxton murder case. He was a doctor who killed his wife and another woman, and she just couldn't get it out of her head. And I think in some ways we do need to process the terrible things that happen in the world. So I wouldn't condemn out of hand. I do think that in the race to try and get yourself in print or onto the airwaves, there is possibly some greater editorial control that needs to come from the broadcasters, especially now, and publishers who in the past might have got it wrong.
I think it's important for publishers and broadcasters to show a little bit of restraint when it comes
Yeah.
to reporting or being inspired by real cases of crime.
Yeah.
I think the ideal scenario is, if you're going to do these things, don't use real names. Don't use real places. The story is still there. I know the storytelling urge is there to tell people what happened. Is there really a need to include the real names and places of people?
I agree, and I think, possibly you have a kind of statute of limitations. It's interesting, this Sarah Bax Horton's book, One-Armed Jack, that we're discussing. The reason she was able to discover the true identity is because there was a D notice put on the papers. They're under the Official Secrets Act for at least a century, because relatives of the murderer could have been upset. There could have been a backlash. And I think that kind of sensitivity is something, we all joke about Victorian values and say how out of date they are. Maybe actually that's a Victorian value we should consider now.
As we wrap up here, Red, I want to point out that there's been a trend in murder mystery novels to include elements of true crime. And it just so happened that on this show, we've reviewed a couple books that do exactly this. Recently, we reviewed Sadie by Courtney Summers, which is a murder mystery, but a huge part of the narrative is an actual true crime podcast, which is edited and put into the audiobook itself.
Yep.
It's a fictional true crime podcast, essentially. Another one is A Good Girl's Guide to Murder, the series by Holly Jackson. This is a bit of a YA one, but it was very popular. But a big part of that one is the main character creates a true crime podcast, and it becomes central to her investigations. Right? There's true crime has become a huge part of it. And this is another book I want to shout out. A Night to Remember by Walter Lord. Have you ever read this one? It's an account that came out in the 1950s of the events of the Titanic.
Oh yeah,
from a bunch of the survivors.
Yeah.
And when I was reading this one, it felt uncomfortable because there were a lot of details of death and horrible things happening. But these are real people. This is a really tragic event that was detailed in detail. And again, one of those things was this feels a little insensitive.
Yeah, although did you feel more uncomfortable watching Leonardo DiCaprio dramatize it on the big screen?
Yeah, I was a little distracted by happily distracted by the romance between Jack and Rose. I unironically love the Red, that's all the time we have for this episode. We'll see you again soon, in about 2 weeks. Have a good one.
Can't wait. Thanks, Jacob.
That was Red Széll. He's the host of My Life in Books on AMI Audio. That show is also available as a podcast. Again, that's My Life in Books. That's all the time we have for this edition of AMI Audiobook Review. The show airs weekends at 1 p.m. Eastern on AMI Audio and repeats every 6 hours. We're on all the big podcasting platforms, and that includes YouTube. You can email us at amioaudiobookraview@ami.ca. That's audiobookreview@ami.ca. And then you can also follow us on Instagram at AMI Audiobook Review. I'm Jacob Szymanski. Thanks for listening.